Hello and welcome to Executive Sessions. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. We're being joined by educational leaders from across the U.S. to break down the topics impacting our industry and communities during challenging times. Well, let's get this conversation started because I'm going to imagine, knowing the three of you, there are going to be some opinions that will be flying and hopefully some data points that people can take away from them. I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, Behind the Scenes District Leaders Priorities for ESSER Funding. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. I'm a partner at Strategos Group. We've got three fantastic guests and an expert here, a colleague, Doug Mesecar. We'll get to him in just a second. I want to welcome in Dr. Steve Joel and Dr. Quintin Shepherd. Dr. Joel joined Lincoln Public Schools in 2010 as superintendent. Previously, he served for 10 years as superintendent in Grand Island, Nebraska, and 8 years in Beatrice, Nebraska. A native of Long Island, New York, he has degrees from Doane College, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Kansas State University, and has been a great friend to me in conversations and transparency from the superintendency position. So, Dr. Joel, great to have you. Thank you for being here today.
Rod, my pleasure.
Dr. Shepherd has quickly become one of my favorite superintendents across the U.S. His willingness to be a 21st century leader and superintendent is on display publicly on a daily basis, and his willingness to share his opinions, his thoughts, his failures, his successes. And he's done this now. He's in his 4th district at Victoria Independent School District in Texas. So really glad to have Quintin on. I also know that you're an avid runner, so I'm not sure if you've already been running this morning, but it makes me feel like I need to get going, and we're not even into January yet. But Quintin, it's great to have you here today. Thank you
for having me.
And I want to obviously welcome in my colleague, Doug Mesecar. He ranks among a small number of education experts who have worked as an education policymaker, entrepreneur, and executive in the private sector. He's built a track record on success with deep knowledge about what drives the K-12 market, from the economic buyer to everyday user. A former teacher, Doug served at the U.S. Department of Education as Deputy Chief of Staff for the department and Assistant Deputy Secretary of the Office of Innovation and Improvement. He also served in the U.S. Congress as a professional staff member for the House Education and Workforce Committee, and he has held senior executive positions for companies serving the K-12 market. Doug, welcome.
Thank you, Rod. Great to be here.
Well, I want to start with this. So this is born out of conversations that have been happening publicly, and I think also behind the scenes with superintendents, principals, community leaders, and those like Doug who are experts in the space at the federal and state and local level. I think there's a confusion or there are some strong opinions that may be not grounded in fact when it comes to the role ESSER is playing in our budgetary processes going not only now, but going forward, and to have a conversation to understand what leading superintendents are doing, and also to make sure that we are chalking the field with what is really not maybe the facts of ESSER, but a better understanding, a deeper knowledge, a deeper awareness of what can be achieved and or approached by utilizing ESSER funds in appropriate ways that maybe we haven't thought about to date. So what I'd like to do is, Quintin, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to sort of open the floor and give you a couple of minutes to talk about how you've approached ESSER funding, but from this perspective. For those that are on the webinar that are attending, and by the way, I want to make sure that people know we're recording this and we will make sure that this gets out to the masses. And in that vein, I also want to thank Strategos Group and EDSB for bringing this conversation together, because these are important conversations. I always get, I'm the beneficiary after these kinds of conversations because I get back channel communication from folks saying that they've learned so much, from leaders across the country and the world. So I want to thank Strategos Group developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. So Quintin, take us back when ESSER funding first came out. Talk about the process that you undertook to better basically situate yourself and your district to understand the parameters and how you might start to tackle the utilization of these funds. If you can take us into that initial sort of experience that you had.
When I first heard about ESSER coming out and the sort of scant details, I mean, there were some scant details as it was first coming out. I just, as I've trained myself to do over the last, almost 2 decades as a superintendent, the first step is to just honor and recognize that you have some thoughts that go through your head, and that's a story that you start telling yourself. But more often than not, that story is not always true. So like, I have 18 years of experience, and this is what I should be thinking about in terms of how we spend these resources and so on and so forth. But pause, that might not be what's best, because like this antiquated leadership paradigm that so much of our literature and training and everything else that we do in education is built on is that the superintendent is the expert. And if you're the smartest person in your community, if you're the expert in your community, good on you. I mean, great. But when you expand that to sort of the global network that we now live in, in all likelihood, you're not the smartest person in the room. But you just aren't. You might be the smartest in your community when it comes to ESSER funding, but you're likely not the smartest person in the nation. And so my initial reaction was to step back and start to call out what, to me, the easiest way to think about it was, what are like more traditional approaches, like tutoring, after school, before school, all this stuff you might expect that happen in a more traditional, we're trying to catch kids up. But then I was really interested in like, let's find some genius idea. Because like somebody out there is saying to themselves, this is the first time we get a chance to take some money like this in a one-time spend, and here's like a crazy idea that might actually work. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can we have conversations over here in this space to encourage superintendents to think creatively. So I reached out to some various groups where superintendents congregate and asked to have that conversation. And then just started harvesting ideas. Like I was just harvesting like what are good ideas in a traditional framework and what are good ideas in a sort of a creative framework. And that just helped inform me to try to make the best decision for my district, or at least present options for my district.
Steve, we'll turn to you, and hopefully I won't have any technical difficulties here. So talk about your approach to it, right? So, this is not your first rodeo. You're very quick to let people know you've been around, and I think that wisdom and experience can play a real role in understanding not just maybe the initial energy that comes from the knowledge that funding is coming in district's way, but also understanding that this is a wave, it's iterative. There are things and parameters to be thought about ahead of time so that we, I think, spend wisely. So can you talk about what was your first thought when you saw the news come down, and how did you approach that with yourself and your team to better appropriate those funds?
As you alluded to, Rod, I've been around for a while. So always can look back and say that there have been times in my career where we all of a sudden found a little pile of money that was granted to us or given to us, or was used to address an initiative that the state was interested in addressing, but never to the scale of ESSER dollars. And so you use the word wisely spend as a phrase, and that was the very first thing that went through my mind, because what I was thinking about is what's the ultimate end game here. Right. So we're now we've given these dollars. And as Quintin alluded to, we can be creative, we can be traditional, we can do whatever we think we need to do to be able to help student outcomes improve. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to show something for these dollars, because one of my very first cautions to our folks, and I did something very, very similar to Quintin, we had a number of kind of think tank conversations, what if, this is the real what if now, because we do have the dollars, what are we going to do? But we're going to have to produce something, because if we don't, there's going to be a lot of skepticism and probably some political involvement with regard to, hey, we gave you the money. You've always said money's been an issue in public education. You guys have been advocating on the Hill for years and years and years. Now you have the dollars, and show us where the needle was moved. So what we've tried to do in Lincoln is very similar to Quintin. We've tried to extend learning time. We've tried to do expand jumpstart summer work for students that are getting ready to enter kindergarten. We've done the tutoring thing. We put together this year, because we still had about 1,100 parents at the beginning of the school year that didn't want to. They had indicated to us that they were not comfortable coming back to school. Because we opened up our school a year ago and we haven't skipped a beat. We ended up putting a remote learning program in, and that the numbers have really dropped dramatically in that remote learning program. Most recently, we spent dollars. We found about 30 teachers that volunteered to do lessons for students that are in quarantine and isolation, because we recognized pretty quickly that we were losing a lot more kids who were close contacts than those that were being afflicted, and the structural damage to their academic continuity was pretty severe. We were seeing that, so we tried to address that. We paid for some additional training for teachers. So we've tried to create balance in doing it, but I will tell you, it's still not the right environment for our kids to thrive, because of what's happening with the pandemic, what's happening with how people are processing the pandemic, parents particularly, and just to throw some cold water or some more fuel onto the flame. Now we've got this new variant that, we're all having to pay attention to as well too. That's going to be a disruptor. So roundabout way of saying, what we've tried to do is wisely spend the dollars to try to get us the best yield on investment. At the end of the day, it's increased student outcomes.
Doug, as you hear Quintin and Steve, could you take us behind the scenes a little bit? Obviously, you're not at the federal level now, but you've had experience. So when we think about intent, right, when it comes to funding, talk a little bit about ESSER and maybe where you're seeing people misinterpret the intent of ESSER, and obviously then the follow-on, which is the application of the funds at the district level.
Yeah, absolutely, Rod. And we, shorthand things because we have to. There's a lot of detail here. So let me first talk about, there's actually 3 ESSER funds, right? We say ESSER and kind of include them all, but there's been a shifting focus over time. The first ESSER money from the CARES Act was from last March. So, almost a year and a half ago now, which is a long time ago. It's shocking to believe it's been that long. But by and large, and Steve and Quintin jump in here if you see this differently, but a lot of that money was very much about responding, emergency responses, getting food to families and kids, PPE, doing those really fundamental health, safety, food, security, those types of issues. And frankly, that was the smallest amount of money. It was $13 billion. That went to states and locals, and a lot of that money's been spent, and rightfully so, right? But in terms of sort of moving the educational needle, Steve, to your point about outcomes, those dollars weren't really focused on outcomes per se, right? You have to have kids back in school and safe and healthy to learn. But the next tranche of money, ESSER 2, which came from the December stimulus money, has a great name. It just rolls right off the tongue, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. Some people say CRSA, which is not probably the way to say it. Some people call it CRSA, whatever you call it. It's the December stimulus money, ESSER 2. And in my mind, that starts to mark a transition, right, from those emergency, immediate crisis needs. Now we're shifting into kids are back in school. We're doing things like Steve mentioned, summer school. Quintin, you've mentioned some of this as well, extended learning time, tutoring. And in a lot of places, and Steve and Quintin, I don't know where, American Rescue Plan dollars, the third tranche of money from this past March, which was the largest amount. It was $122 billion, right? The combined total was $200 billion, almost about 190. So you really, though, have to think about these in 3 tranches and sort of a continuum of services from health and safety, getting schools reopened, addressing immediate needs. Steve, I really liked what you said about how we're processing this. What are the mental health needs? Getting kids used to being back in school, right? No small issue of just sort of reacquainting them, particularly the younger kids, of being in school all day long. And now in many places, as the biggest tranche of dollars from the American Rescue Plan starts to flow down to the district level and school level, how can these funds be used, to use a word, wisely, also knowing that they run out? There's a end point for these dollars. So it's a large infusion that's time delimited. And they really, again, Steve, picking up on something you said about there needs to be something to show for these dollars. What does that look like? Because in many districts, it may not be true for both of you, but in many districts, the pre-pandemic status quo is not the ideal we should be shooting for. For a lot of kids, that left their education, their wellness behind. And so what are some of the big bets? And I'd love, Rod, if we could start to talk about, with this big tranche of money from the American Rescue Plan that in many cases has not been tapped yet, how do you start to make those bigger bets? How do you start to really address some of the fundamentals that exist in our system that really could be a lot better for many more kids than it is today? I'll end on this, Rod. Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, got in trouble. One of my favorite sayings is, never let a good crisis go to waste. And he got into some trouble. This was back during the financial crisis in 2008. And he's not wrong, right? This is a crisis. We're kind of still in it, sort of, kind of, hard to say with this new variant, but it is an opportunity to perhaps re-examine some of the practices, some of the things that we've done, and we have a financial boost if we want to maybe chart some different courses than we did before as we address some of those immediate current needs. So it's a balancing act, Rod, but I think there's opportunity going forward to really think boldly about where we want to wind up in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years from now. And hopefully that's not the place where we began 2 years ago before the pandemic hit, because I think that would be an opportunity missed.
Thank you, Doug. Quintin, to what Doug is talking about, these big bets, talk about how you evaluated those big bets against what had been done in Victoria pre-pandemic, what was requested by, and I think from the local community, and how that might have played a role in the plans that you have set forth, understanding there is an endpoint, because I think that's a very important element to put into this discussion.
Sure. So I'll give a concrete answer, and then I'm going to get a little more abstract, because I think it's important to this conversation. So a concrete answer, like what were some of the big bets? It was really a return on investment thing. I mean, to put it simply. So like, for instance, when we were first coming out of the pandemic, we were looking at about 900 kids who had just disappeared. So we were considering them potential dropouts or what have you. And 900 kids, obviously that's a lot. We were saying to ourselves, well, how many staff members could we potentially appoint to this that's more than truancy? Like, this is just recovery staff. And so we decided to go with administrators. We landed on 2 is all we felt like we needed. And of that group of 900 kids that we don't know where they would have gone or if they would have come back to education, we're down to 32. We're down to 32 kids. So the net return on investment, well over $4 million per year, just for having the kids back. That's more than paid for itself in terms of an investment. But that was something that some districts would have to look at, and maybe not others, which leads me to the broader piece, which is I'm experiencing a level of frustration as I talk to my colleagues around the country, in that the ESSER dollars, the way that they were structured to be funneled to districts, was largely based on your socioeconomic status. So the higher your SES status, the more dollars you got as a proportion, as a percentage, and then based on enrollment, what have you. But the reality is, for most of the colleagues that I've talked to around the country, when you are in very, very high, low SES districts, what you regularly and routinely find is that those same communities are oftentimes not supportive of bond initiative and facility improvements. So we have some of the worst facilities in the country, hands down. Some of the worst, and just because there simply aren't the tax dollars in the local community, don't support tax increases, and some money's not there. So as superintendent, then you're faced with this immeasurable, almost crushing pressure that the ESSER funding can be used for things like HVAC systems and improving air quality, windows, and like. But everybody on this call and everybody in America knows that that's not how you improve student achievement. But if my kids don't have air conditioning, and it's South Texas, guess what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about air conditioning, because I know that passing a bond in my community is next to impossible. And so what's happening for a lot of us is, how much do we must we spend on infrastructure needs? And then what remains of that pie, like, how can we get the biggest return on our investment? So back to the staff that bring kids back to school, back to high impact tutoring opportunities for kids. But I think there's this misnomer in the country that, oh, we flooded, a bunch of money to schools and they're going to use it to improve student learning. No. A lot of schools are using billions of dollars to do infrastructure upgrades because they haven't been able to, in some instances, in decades, which is frustrating. And I think it to me, it's a call to improve how we do school finance nationwide. I've been in 3 different states as a superintendent. I can tell you no state has it figured out from my perspective. Some are better than others, but largely it is one of the most inequitable things you could possibly imagine.
Doug, can you speak to this? Because I'm hoping that this is not breaking news, but I also think I put my community hat on. I mean, shoot, my father hat on and say, well, wait a minute. When we're talking about how we're laying out these funds, and then you hear what Quintin's talking about relative to what he needs in his district and the relation to executing against what the community either desires or doesn't based on resources, it feels like maybe the intent goes sort of sideways. Like, how can we understand how to apply these three phases of funding in a way that can support a Victoria and other districts like Quintin's in a more equitable manner moving forward? Because you're right, I can't fathom that, you're going to have to go out in this two-pronged marketing approach, Quintin, and talk about teaching and learning developments, all the while knowing that the kids are sweating in a hot classroom that doesn't have HVAC, right? Like that seems counter to what we're trying to achieve. What are your thoughts, Doug?
Yeah, I'm hearing that more and more, Quintin, that a large percentage, I can't put a number on it because there's not a lot of data that speaks to it, but a lot of conversation leads me to believe that this is happening across the country, that a large percentage of these dollars, particularly the second two tranches of dollars, are going to renovation and actually new school construction. It is allowed. It is a authorized use of funds. Now, I would question whether you could get how much construction you can get done in 3 years, knowing construction timelines. But nonetheless, I think that's one of the reasons why Congress put in a minimum that 20% of your ESSER 3, your American Rescue Plan dollars, has to be spent on, in the legislation, they call it learning loss. So I'm going to use that term because that's what the legislation uses, but it's defined broadly to be both academic and social and emotional learning. And so I do think there was some recognition right at the district level to sort of cordon off some of these funds specifically for academic and SEL, knowing that the rest of the funds may be otherwise used. But there's a trade-off, right? Because these funds are incredibly flexible. They're the most flexible, dollars that I can remember, and in this amount coming from the federal government. So it puts a ton of pressure on Steve and on Quintin to navigate, the needs of the system, the resources and the input from the community, and try to balance those out and have something to show at the end of these, when these funds start to run out. What was accomplished, what was achieved will absolutely be the question. In fact, just last week, the House Education Committee had a whole hearing on what are we seeing from from not just the American Rescue Plan, but all the ESSER dollars. So it is a very active discussion at the federal level about what we're going to achieve with these dollars. And I think for some group of politicians, renovation and new school construction, absolutely needed. They'll be completely fine with that. I think for a different group of politicians, they'll think, why? Like, we didn't see the academic needle move. And so why should we continue to support large amounts of dollars being funded if we're not actually seeing an ROI on the academic piece, Quintin, to your point about ROI. So this is an active debate, and one that Steve and Quintin, I know that you're dealing with every day. But Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts too on this issue about using funds for infrastructure versus academics, and just how to balance that equation, because there's certainly needs. There's no question that a lot of districts have a long list of infrastructure needs that just haven't been able to be addressed over the years.
And always have had and always will have a long list of infrastructure needs. I'll add one more to the conversation, and that is compensation for educators and those that support education, because historically in the education profession, we can only compensate within the means that we have available to us. And all it took was one district in Nebraska that said that they were going to use ESSER dollars to reward teachers, and the pressure, the association pressure that was put on all the other districts was pretty intense and pretty severe. And board members, always want to do the right thing for educators. And of course, we said, nope, that's not going to be a justifiable expense. And that became a little bit of an issue in Lincoln that we had to work our way through. So when I heard that 20% of the dollars had to be dedicated to learning acceleration, we tried to turn that into a positive, not a negative. But you're right in terms of how it's written, Doug. I knew immediately that that was not enough, that was going to open up the door for every single superintendent and board of education to say, let's take care of the needs that we've identified that we don't have a mechanism to pay for. And in fact, that's what's going to happen. There'll be a full audit of this, in my opinion, at some point in the future. And I think the public's going to be disappointed how those dollars are spent. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like most of us have one-to-one laptop initiatives, right? But how do we pay for refresh, right? So we particularly in tough budgetary times, we had our first decline in enrollment in Lincoln's history a year ago. We were down like 400 students. We've been growing 700 to 1,100 students a year for the decade that I've been here. And we lost kids through the pandemic, primarily to homeschool. That took its toll on our general fund. We had to cut 12 million and 11 million, $23 million, which our Board of Education has basically said, this is not why we got on the board to cut budgets. And we have to figure out ways to maintain what we have and continue to do good people. So I think that there was, because it was only 20%, there was this real sit on Santa's lap and let's go take care of all of our infrastructure needs. Because to Quintin's point earlier, if the environment that the student's learning in isn't conducive to high quality learning, then it isn't going to matter as much as we want it to how high quality the instruction is. If kids are hot or kids are cold, or the environment is too noisy, or whatever the issue might be, it's going to be an impediment and a barrier. And I think that's what superintendents face. We made a decision several years ago, cost us a lot of money. We put audio enhancement systems in every one of our classrooms. We recognized that kids weren't hearing clearly. We're a state with high allergy percentages. And the big challenge that we had now is we've had it for about 6 or 7 years, year 8, year 9, you got to start refreshing all of those in addition to your laptop. So what we've tried to do here is find balance. I think, without having the numbers in front of me, we're more than 20% dedicated to learning acceleration, because I just feel like we're going to be answering some very, very difficult political questions in the next election cycle. Because as I've said before, and I want to say again, we've never had these kind of dollars handed to us. And I think sometimes we have to be careful of what we ask for, because money and funds and grants don't come free gratis. They come with strings attached. We have to be able to produce something. So our hope is that, we can get ourselves right with the kids that we've lost. And, I'm really happy to hear that in Victoria, they were able to get all of those kids back. And we've gotten the vast majority of our kids back too. But the reality of it is our kids in poverty are still struggling mightily. And we're going to have to really increase our supports.
Quintin, I want to turn to you and explore what I might call strategic spending. So there's practical spending, what you're talking about, but I'm wondering this sort of stair-step approach, meaning if you're getting to a point where you've got to have community participation and involvement, right, and support on a number of different levels, it feels like maybe this is an opportunity, to Doug's point about, Rahm Emanuel and what happens in a crisis and taking advantage of that. In that, can you talk about these big bets and the investment, or at least the discussions around strategic spending that might help to slowly integrate in parents and family members into the learning that is going on for a given student, as a way for them to start to see on a more active and daily basis what is going on in the classroom? Because it feels like we have transitioned over a bit, and the remote learning, the hybrid learning environments have kind of forced the issue. And it says to me that maybe there's an opportunity to invest in different technologies or opportunities or support systems that allow for that constant engagement or more readily available engagement, so that they feel a part of the conversation, so that when a bond comes up or when a big ask comes up from a letter from the superintendent or an op-ed in the local newspaper, they're attentive, they're ready to participate and sort of get behind it. Is that fair or foul to be thinking in that way from a strategic relative to practical spending practice?
It's fair and strategic, absolutely. But from a practical sense, and you're right, bringing parents into the conversation is a key part of it. But again, in a practical sense, ESSER 2 largely spent on technology and devices and what have you. Like that was a big part of ESSER 2. And what we all told ourselves was this like great big myth around the country that if we give devices to kids who have not traditionally had them, and we give them hotspots, and we figure out a way to get them on Wi-Fi and make sure that Teams is uploaded to the computer, that we've done this magnificent job of closing an equity gap in this country in a way that we've never done before. And I read that hundreds, if not thousands of times. But the reality was we actually made the equity gap wider, because for families and kids who've always grown up around technology, they know how to use technology. They're comfortable with technology. Parents know how to supervise technology. Kids know how to log on. All these things that we kind of take for granted. And for a number of families, like a large percentage, putting technology in the home did not increase student learning. The kids in many circumstances didn't turn it on. And when they did turn it on and had tech problems, they couldn't get help. And parents weren't insisting that the kids were logging on and insisting that they pay attention and creating a space for them to learn independently, headphones if needed, like all this stuff that maybe we would take for granted because our kids likely all had technology in their lives. This wasn't taken for granted. And so what we saw was a widening of the gap over the course of last year. For the kids who've been around technology most of their lives and the kids who hadn't, that there was a huge separation. So you're absolutely right. If I could go back a year ago, one thing that I would change, the single most important thing that I would have changed, is that there's this understanding that the district essentially has a contract with the school. Like, we're going to give you this and this and this and this and this, and in return, you're going to give us this. And it's got all kind of spelled out. And it's not a formal contract, but in a very real sense, it is a legal contract, right? What we should have done is we should have said from the school's perspective that we're now going to institute a contract with the home. Like, here's what we're going to provide for you, and this is the expectation, and so on and so forth, and here's what you're going to provide back to us, and this contract is how your student's going to learn, and if one of us doesn't fulfill our obligations in the contract, the student returns to the classroom. I would make that change, and I think that would have undone a lot of the problems that we're facing as a result of it. But to your point, yes, some of this money should absolutely be invested in bringing parents in. So for the students who have the supports, it absolutely makes sense to continue to find ways to engage those parents in high quality learning and tutoring and things that we're doing for those kids. And I think for the kids who typically haven't had those resources available, we need to think about engaging those parents differently and saying, this is why it's really important that you know how to use technology and how to supervise technology in the home, because we might face another pandemic, or we may face, a huge flu outbreak at some point. We have to close down. We want for your students to be able to learn, and so we need for parents and family structures to be able to support that learning in the home. But it's two different types of engaging the parents that's really important.
Thank you, Quintin. Steve, as you start to look back, I mean, I get the sense that you're someone that you always want to keep a beat on sort of where you might be stepping in a pothole or not, and trying to avoid that, and just being thoughtful about that. Have you recognized or evaluated potential blind spots just in sort of the process that you've undertaken as a district, and how have you looked to avoid those potholes or blind spots in ways that allow for growth and learning, just as a team as well? Because Quintin, you bring up such an interesting point about this sort of implied contract between district and school, and now really district and family, or from school to family, and just sort of this relationship that we're right. And it seems to me that there is going to be a learning curve to that. So Steve, can you talk a little bit about that process and auditing, and maybe looking back retrospectively a little bit?
Well, one advantage again I had with this is just having done it for a number of years. So we were going to avoid sitting in a circle and just calling out all of those pet projects that we've always wanted to do. And, we quickly focused on the things that are most important. Well, I'm really big on, if you don't build the base, if you don't build the foundation and you don't strengthen the foundation, then everything that you do in terms of intervention is probably not going to have the level of success with which you desire. So I'll give you an example. We have full service community schools in our title schools. And that's something that we've had to invest heavily in. It's pretty expensive once 21st century grants begin to expire. But we wanted to put some dollars in a couple of our sites because we were losing the continuity that represented. This brings families and students, into school, and it also brings in community services, because we recognize that if parents aren't engaging and they're not accessing community resources, it's pretty likely that their students are not going to do very well in school. And as we found out, many of their children were staying home because they were in poverty. And, that was one of the things we didn't count on. We didn't anticipate that more of our students in poverty as a percentage were going to participate in a hybrid environment than students that had parents with resources. I mean, that was an aha for me, because I would have predicted the complete opposite, and it didn't happen. So learning loss was actually exacerbated through the pandemic, because the kids who should have been in school and needed to be in school were home, and in many cases it was because their parents were ill-informed with regard to what are the risks, if that makes any sense. And so for us, we knew we had to invest in engaging parents at the base level, which happens to be when their students are starting their academic careers in the elementary school. So that was one. The other one was that, as tempting as it is to jump onto a trend, if you will, for example, we did the hotspot thing too. There was a ton of pressure on us to get equity and access. Kids need access at home, but Quintin's 100% correct. If that's not supervised in the home environment, and parents don't know how to supervise it, and the students don't know how to problem solve and troubleshoot, then those hotspots really don't get the bang for the buck. So we just did our level best to stay focused to how we want to spend those dollars as strategically as possible, with the ultimate outcome of building and strengthening the culture, the foundation of the school system, getting parents involved as early as we can, and then looking at those interventions along their academic journey that would give them a chance to get caught up. But I have to tell you, I'm not going to write a book on how successful it's been, because we're as behind as anybody in America right now. And I happen to think we're a very good school system, and we are by comparative measures. But if you measure yourself by how well your kids in poverty do, we're struggling.
I think, could I, do you mind, Rod, if I
Please.
jump in on that? I always learn so much whenever I listen to Steve talk about it, because he has a way of phrasing things that resonate so clearly with me. Like, I think what I'm hearing him say here is this general feeling that is pervasive in education right now. Like, there's this, folks are talking about the COVID hangover. That's the phrase that I keep hearing over and over again. Like, teachers are feeling down, principals are feeling down, superintendents are feeling down. And it's like, why is it that we're all feeling so down? And it's not just COVID. I mean, COVID was stressful. COVID was hard. COVID put us all in a position we've never been before, and on and on and on. But it's not just that. I think for a lot of people, especially folks who've been in this industry for a long time, we recognize that we had decades where we could have been closing equity gaps in meaningful ways that we just didn't do. We just didn't do it because we didn't see it. And now we can look in retrospect and say, my God, talk about the biggest missed opportunity. And then COVID hit and all these funding, but in so many ways, it actually made the problems worse. Whether you're talking infrastructure or student learning or whatever else, it actually just magnified those equity issues. And so I think there's just a level of personal disappointment that we didn't do more. And I don't know how as a country we kind of moved past that, but I do think the first step is just honoring it. Just honor the fact that we put ourselves in this position. It's the old adage that everything has a price. No, excuse me, everything in life has a cost. It's just that sometimes you don't know the price. The cost, we lived, for
Well
years
said.
not thinking about it, and now we're paying the price.
Doug, I'm going to give you the Steve, did you want to comment on that?
The only thing I want to say is
Sure.
I so appreciate the way Quintin phrased that as well, too, because we've had lots and lots of years and decades to move the needle in a way that society would have expected us to do that. And we've had just a modicum of success. And now we've received this tranche of dollars that we can truly dedicate any way we want. And we're struggling to find the best purpose and the best impact to be able to do that. And so much of it is because it's an overwhelming task. There are so many environmental issues that we have to address through the work that we do as educators, that it's difficult to see the forest through the trees. And that's tough. And we're fortunate. We live in a community that supports us with a lot of partnerships, and it's still tough. And I feel badly for those districts that don't have access to that, because they're probably even they're facing even more dire circumstances.
Well, I hope that the audience has been able to see what I said at the outset, which is the fantastic transparency and humility with which Dr. Joel and Dr. Shepherd bring to their roles as superintendents. Doug, I want to leave you with the last word just on resources when we talk about it. I mean, I just really appreciate, Steve just saying there, look, we, in essence, we don't have all the answers and we're still sort of learning as we go, because I think that's important in this journey in uncharted waters. Can you talk about just where you are staying up to date when it comes to funding and getting questions answered? You're always the guy that people go to sort of in the know. Can you provide some resources or just take us into your brain? Where do you look to stay up to task on this?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a tough task to stay on top of what's happening. There's dollars being spent, there's dollars being obligated, which means they're not spent yet. There's confusion about, well, which tranche of funds, is a certain activity being funded out of. I think the bottom line is it's conversations like this. It's talking with your colleagues and Steve and Quintin. I just am so grateful that you've spent, this time with us talking about how you've thought through this, how you're thinking about it through the future, sort of state that you want to get to. And so it's these kinds of conversations, Rod, that are happening across the country that we need more of. We need to elevate these conversations. These are thorny, difficult, complicated issues, and not spending the time on thinking through them and talking through them is probably the worst possible thing. Go slow, start slow to go fast, whatever that saying is. This is the time, right? The first two tranches of dollars in lots of places are spent or already obligated, but it's the third biggest tranche that still is yet to be fully employed. And my urging would be for folks to, make sure you're having the conversations you need to have to get to that future state that you need. Because both to your point, Steve and Quintin, we need to figure out a better path forward and maybe a silver lining out of the pandemic, out of all of the chaos and the stress and the confusion, is that we'll find some of those creative strategies that will lead us to a better state than we arrived at before the pandemic, really took us all on a complete journey here. So there's lots of different, the US government has some resources about what's being spent, but in terms of the best practices, it's communities of leaders like Steve and Quintin are leading, where the best ideas will emerge and hopefully get traction across the country.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining Behind the Scenes District Leaders Priorities for ESSER Funding. We want to thank Dr. Steve Joel of Lincoln Public Schools, Dr. Quintin Shepherd of Victoria Independent School District, and Doug Mesecar and myself for being part of Strategos Group. We want to thank those that helped bring this conversation together. We mentioned Strategos Group developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. And one last reminder, this is being recorded, so we will dispense this out so we can keep this conversation, to Doug's point, elevated. And I would encourage folks to reach out to Steve and to Quintin, because they're fantastic mentors, I think, and colleagues and peers of those around the country, not just superintendents, but principals and thought leaders across U.S. education. Once again, I'm your host and moderator. It's been a pleasure. I'm Dr. Rod Berger.